Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu. Good morning. It's been several weeks now that we've been isolated from each other. I'm sure we're anxious, and it's been a very strange way of living. And yet, there's something we can do about this. We're fortunate to be in California, where Governor Newsom has instigated our stay-at-home directive early on. And so, relative to other states, California has had a rather low incidence of both infection and deaths. And so I want to encourage people and thank you all for staying at home, keeping others from being infected, and that this has been successful. And so I do encourage all of us to continue with this. Now, this stay-at-home directive, this whole way of life has been changed. And for many of us, for most of us, it's something new. But 80 years ago, our community experienced something very similar. Executive Order 9066 had ordered all people of Japanese ancestry away from the West Coast and put into concentration camps more in the interior of the country. That meant that people lost everything, their homes, farms, their way of life. They were taken out of schools. Much more of a disruption of their lives than what we're experiencing now. And yet this happened. Now, what was life like in these camps? Whole families were put into barracks, where a whole family was put into one room with only blankets to separate the beds, making sort of a separation of rooms. If you had to go to the bathroom, it was in a building at the end of the block. The same was true for group showers and doing the laundry. Every meal was taken in the mess hall, which was in another building. Many families lost control of their children when they had to eat in groups and the kids ran off to eat with their friends. It's kind of humorous that my mother, in her later years, we had her into an assisted living, which was actually a very nice place. But she took her meals in a dining room, and to her, eating a meal in a public dining room was something she called the mess hall. We had to continually remind her, it's not a mess hall, Mom, it's a dining room. But the reason I bring up this thing is that as a community, we had a personal experience of this. And so what did we learn from it? How did our parents and grandparents deal with this challenge? In our normal lives, we have certain values, and yet when it's challenged with a disruption so major, we have to question, what are our values? What guides our lives? When we lose the usual values of a steady job, income, schools, being in a community, we have to search for what really guides our lives. And it brings up these questions of life and death. Life is not fair. Good fortune and tragedy can affect any of us. A natural or human tragedy can affect anyone at any time. Right now, there are over 35,000 Americans who have died from this virus. And this means that even in our community, we have to look at it as a world community. It's like that example we have of hearing a fire siren going off. When it's off in the distance, we pay little attention to it. And then we might get a little more concerned when it gets closer. A real concern when we realize that the siren is stopping in front of our house. It is our house that's burning. The pandemic is in our front yard. Sometimes many people think that Buddhism and religion is just something like a topic that can be discussed. But in times like this, it becomes a real issue. What does Buddhism say about our life? The principles of Buddhism become quite clear, and we realize that the Buddha's intent was to seek a resolution to illness, old age, and death. As Shin Buddhists, we have the Nembutsu, Namo Amida Butsu. Now, how does that affect us in a time like this? In our previous Buddhism 123 video, we talk about thank you being an opening gate or a first step in really experiencing the Nembutsu journey. And I say it's a beginning step because it just puts us in a different frame of mind rather than many religions that look at pleas or prayer for the future. Nembutsu looks at our life as focusing on what we have already received. And using the term thank you is a way to place ourselves in this. With very little explanation, we can begin to understand the basic intent of Namo Amida Butsu. But today I want to focus on another aspect of this. Amida Butsu is a Japanese word for Amida Buddha. Amida being a Japanese word that symbolizes two things, wisdom and compassion, light and life. The human qualities of wisdom and compassion are a little easier to understand than light and life. And it means that we're helped. We take refuge in or are one with wisdom and compassion. And we can think of it like the love of a parent, something that surrounds us. We may not be able to see it, but it's been with us all our lives. To give you an example, I was on a vision quest, one of my early ones. As I found my spot, I set up a tarp. We didn't use tents, we used tarps so that we could be out in the elements. And I put my sleeping bag and things under it. I went off to get some water. And as I was returning, it started to rain, so I got under my tarp. And the rain turned to hail. It got very cold. And so with all my clothes on, I got into my sleeping bag. And I was still cold. I was freezing, and it continued to hail. It got to be so bad I started to cry. And in that moment, I started to recite the Nembutsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu. And in a sense, it settled me. It gave me some sense of comfort to know that I was still protected. And I felt very much comforted, even if I was alone in the wilderness, fasting, and in this hailstorm. And so this reassurance is something that, saying the Nembutsu did not just come out of the blue, this sense of comfort. Just as I had prepared my campsite, instead of reaching my site and just kind of enjoying the surroundings, I went about setting up my tarp, finding a very protected place, putting my things together. I was preparing. In the same way, the Nembutsu, with the Nembutsu, I had it prepared. In other words, my family, and especially my grandmother, had given me an experience of what the Nembutsu might mean. And so I didn't just say it and wonder, what does it mean? I had this sense that I was being protected, that I was being comforted. And I think it's the same sense of comfort that the Issei and Nisei felt during World War II, during this time of evacuation and into this strange environment of the camps. They didn't know what the future would be like. It was over 3 years that they were in these places. And yet, with this sense of not knowing the future, they were held with a sense of compassion, of wisdom and compassion, and a sense of security. And so it's not so much, how what happens to us, but how we respond to what happens to us. My father was, at that time, before the war, had a small green grocery, and he lost everything. His grocery, his house, his probably truck, and was taken away. When we went back to San Jose about 5 years later, he was a clerk in someone else's store rather than his own. And yet, I didn't hear any words of anger from him. He just took these things as a way of life, and he responded to it very nicely, as he raised us without any feeling of animosity. And so I think he was sustained by this Nembutsu, Namo Amida Butsu, and the two words that many of us are familiar with, shigata ganai and gaman. Shigata ganai, it can't be helped, situations that are beyond our control. And gaman, a sense of patience and perseverance, that somehow we're still held in the compassion of wisdom and compassion. And there's another way that we can think of the Nembutsu, that although we feel we're supported by others, we can think of supporting others. If this is an expression that we are interdependent, that we are all held together, we can use this thought of thinking of others. Shindan, when he was in Echigo, he was exiled, did not complain. What he did was identified himself with others. He did not have a small ego centered or trying to destroy his own ego. He expanded it and included the villagers of the Kanto and Echigo areas. And so we might do that the same. If we feel the compassion of the unseen source supporting us, we could be also a source of compassion for others. And in this isolation that we're experiencing right now, we can support each other by making phone calls, writing emails, or even letters. And what's very encouraging is that the people of San Diego are already doing this, connecting with each other, making our Sangha really feel connected, Indra's net, that we are supporting each other, both feeling the support of others and being a support for others. And so we have this thought of not only our own ego, but a community ego. And so, again, to review, we're in a situation that for most of us are really strange new territory. And yet, because of the experiences that our community has experienced in the past, we know that we can get through this and we could be supportive of each other. That these words of shigata ganai, things that can't be helped, and gaman, to persevere, be patient, and to do the right things to help us through this. I hope we will continue to stay at home and obey these guidelines directed by our governor. As we watch TV, there are groups now that are protesting this stay-at-home directive, being somewhat ignorant of the danger of the virus being so contagious. And it reminds me of a teenager defying, the logical rules of a parent of behaving oneself for his own good. People seem to be defying that without realizing that they are endangering not only themselves but the lives of others. So again, thank you for staying at home, being thoughtful of others, and being connected to others. And with that, we will end this talk again with the recitation of the Nembutsu, which reminds us that we are supported by others and we support others. So please join me. Gassho, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu.